This is episode 57 of the Fire Protection Podcast, powered by Inspect Point. Today, my guests are Mark Wilson and Tim Renaud. Mark and Tim have just started a new fire podcast out there called the CFAA Fire Alarm Technician Podcast, kind of focusing on the Canadian market for fire alarms specifically. There's obviously a gap in some of the fire alarm podcasting out there, and they found a really cool niche. They both part-time help out with the CFAA, the Canadian Fire Alarm Association, which is a great association up in Canada for the fire alarm industry. Mark works for Troy Life and Fire Safety, and Tim works for Honeywell Notifier full time. So really cool to have them on, talk about how they started a podcast, why they did that, and kind of the challenges coming down the line within Canada with some new code with the ULC code. So we really get into that at a high level. And it was really cool to have them on and kick off their podcast. And they've got a lot coming out in the first half of the year. So yeah, like, subscribe, give some feedback, and enjoy the podcast. Thanks. All right. So have you guys been on a podcast before?
On
Just
a
our own.
podcast? No.
It's nice to see you guys here. This is Mark Wilson and Tim Renaud from obviously I'll let them do an intro, but they just launched this new CFAA Fire Alarm Tech podcast. And it's really cool to see more podcasts coming out, and we haven't had a new one in a while. It's kind of industry agnostic, just talking about issues within the industry and stuff like that. And I think I caught Mark spreading it the other day, so I was like, let's get him on the podcast, talk about it. So
Great.
Welcome guys to the Fire Protection Podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So and feel free, whoever wants to talk, talk as much as you want. Why did you start the podcast, and give us a little background.
All right. So back in the fall, I took on the role of being marketing director nationally for the Canadian Fire Alarm Association. And part of my responsibilities in this volunteer position are to be in charge of the e-journal for CFA, which is put out usually every second month. And it goes out to a mailing list, all over, a lot of different people within and outside of Canada. And it, though it is directed towards our registered technicians, it has technical columns that could be interesting for anybody in fire alarm. So if you wanted to subscribe to that, you go to the CFAA website, cfaa.ca, and then you can subscribe to the e-journal there. Then from there, it was trying to find other ways of doing communication that are, a little bit faster, maybe in frequency. So then I've been thinking about a podcast since I'm a musician and a music producer. Doing a podcast is kind of a blend of my talents of being in fire alarm and all these things together. So it kind of seemed like a logical progression to go there. And so that's what we've started. The goal was to start January 1st. And so we dropped the first podcast January 1st. And the goal at first was to do it monthly. And I soon figured out I had so many requests for content and so much content. So we're going to do it bi-weekly. We're going to do it every second week and see how that goes. So we're slated, and Mark and I have been working on a schedule here, and we're pretty much slated out to June right now with a plan and with almost everything recorded already. So it's going along really well. Yeah. And if we can keep that up, then our production schedule stays ahead of dropping them, and it'll be good.
Wow. You have all of them recorded through June.
Almost to June. We're almost there.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, remember, we're a lot shorter than yours, so it's
a
little less time consuming, right?
But right. I am doing a lot more, editing and trying to keep it a tight podcast. So sometimes the conversations will be 40 minutes, and I'm chopping down to make them consumable as a 30-minute max is what I really want to, keep it
Yep.
to. So somewhere between 15 and 30. I don't want to stop a conversation if it's going well, as you probably don't. If it's going well, I want to keep it going. And if it's useful for everyone, everybody else, then good.
No, I fully agree. So, I guess what are you, Tim, what is your background? Mark, you can follow up with him. What's your background in fire alarm and I guess fire protection?
Yeah. So I was, when I was 19, 20, I pulled wire and did, fire alarm for a friend, kind of a musician friend of mine. And just started doing that. And then he had a very small company, and I was the junior kid, with no credentials at that time, early 90s. There wasn't really much for credentials to get.
Right.
And then they lost some contracts, and I was the little guy on the totem pole. So I ended up I was a bike mechanic for a while, and I was in telecom for a while. I did microwave radio
Oh, wow.
telecommunications for a while and traveled all over Canada doing that. And then I came back. It was very, very up and down industry being in that, right? And had a
Yeah.
kid on the way. I was getting married in early 2000s. And I thought, that fire alarm thing, that was really good. So I went back, took some night courses, got my credentials up, because at that time now, BC, I'm in British Columbia, Canada. And here we had some credentials that you need. It's all through the ASTT. So it's a like CFAA, but it's local in
Right.
BC. We're working now on getting CFA being the credentials also in BC.
Oh, nice.
So at that time, you went to British Columbia Institute of Technology and, took courses. And so I did that, got back into fire alarm and worked at a couple of different fire alarm companies as a tech. And then I started working for a notifier distributor, and then, quickly went from being a tech to project manager to being in sales, to being the lead sales guy. And then this opportunity came up to be regional sales manager for notifier for the product I was repping, or that I was selling. So the rep was retiring, and so I went for the job.
Perfect.
And I've been doing that since 2015 now. I have all of Western
Wow.
Canada, so it's a big area. I have BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Yukon, and Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. So if you look on a map of North America, that's about 1/4 of North America.
Funny enough, I have it up, and I just, because I knew you were Western manager, I'm like, does he go all the way up to Yukon, Northwest Territories? I
Yeah,
think,
once in a while. Yeah.
yeah,
Most of the
that's
decisions on those jobs are done down in Edmonton or Vancouver or Toronto. So
sure.
it's not always you need to go up there as a rep, but it sure is a fun trip. I love those cities up there. Whitehorse is an amazing town if you ever get a chance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard you probably get to see some cool projects too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Mark, I know you've transitioned lately to a new company. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so similar. I'm an electrician by trade, so that's kind of where I got my start. But I was doing nothing to do with fire alarm. Funny enough, it was all PLC, motor control, high voltage stuff. And where I was working was shift work and night shifts, and so you do that for a while, and then on my night shifts, I'd be looking online at different colleges and what else can I do rather than sit here
Right.
all night and work.
Yeah.
So I came across a fire protection engineering tech diploma at a college in Ontario. So I said, you know what, now or never, and I picked up and took a leave of absence from my job. Went and did that. And then when I came back in Alberta at the time, it wasn't very difficult to get a job as a fire alarm technician. So
Yeah.
kind of fell into it and haven't really looked back since. So I've done a lot of different roles, being a technician, similar to Tim, working my way up through, supervisory management, sales, kind of had spent a little bit of time anyways, doing pretty much everything you could want to do in this industry. So now I'm the Alberta Regional Manager for Troy Fire and Life Safety. So I look after the fire alarm division here in Alberta, and and been involved with the CFA for I think more than a decade now. Just helping in Alberta. We have a chapter here that our big focus right now really is trying to just show value to our membership. So all the technicians who are CFA registered technicians, they want to get something out of it, right? So
Right.
We've been doing monthly webinars and just trying to increase that engagement and outreach. So when Tim approached me about, the podcast, I was like, yeah, that makes total sense. We should definitely do that.
Yeah, and I feel like podcasting, it's quick snippets. Like you can listen on the way to your job site or your office or whatever, and you're constantly getting some new information about new products or just what's happening in other parts of the industry, right?
Yeah, and that's really what we wanted to do is exactly that. Obviously everybody's busy, and to put out a long form podcast on a code topic is going to put people to sleep. So
Yeah.
we thought, let's keep it to like 15 minutes, and then a technician on their way to their first job in the morning, or maybe on their way home, after work, they can listen and get that new information or
Sure.
some new perspective, right?
And I like to think that as an early user, like I've been doing podcasts or listening to podcasts, consumer of podcasts since 2007. So, I've been doing market research, I guess, since then, because, thinking about it, it's which podcast do I listen to? How do I listen to them? The hour and a half podcasts I listen to while I'm on a long bike ride,
Right.
and they're in the background. I'm in one ear, and those are great for that, but they're not active listening. And the active listening podcasts, New York Times Daily, those kind of podcasts where I actually want to hear every word, they're 15, 20 minutes.
Yep.
And that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, they're more often too, like what you guys are saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, and then you have the long form podcast, which is just like a 3 hour interview. I'm like, oh man, how do you digest that? And when do you have time for that? On top of that. So
When you have insomnia.
yeah, right. Getting to the tech training side, I know that's been big in the CFAA. I get all their alerts on you guys do a lot of training throughout Canada and different provinces and everything. Has that morphed over the last few years with going remote versus in person, and how has that experience been?
Yep.
Yeah,
Mark,
I
you want to
think
speak to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it definitely has. I mean, if we go back 10 years ago or something, each chapter, each, provincial chapter would typically do, once a year, a seminar of some type. We'd call it our annual technical seminar. And that was about it. There was some chapters doing, maybe a few lunch and learns throughout the year, but it was always in person, right?
Yep.
And some of our provinces, here in Canada are quite large, right? So just the geography is really big, and the expectation that a technician is going to travel 800 kilometers to go to an event is, I mean, they're just not, right.
Oh, yeah.
It's not feasible. So in more recent years, being able to do more virtual and webinar, and just that now through COVID everyone's a little more comfortable with the medium, I think has helped a lot. And so it's allowed us to increase our frequency. And, like I said, we do a webinar here in Alberta. We try and do it once a month, and we typically get, anywhere from 50 to 100 people on it. So it's been great.
No, yeah, you have a good point on the pandemic kind of making people comfortable with virtual. I sit on NFPA 915, which is NFPA standard for remote inspection and testing and inspection and
Yeah.
testing. I forgot they added testing on that. So and that's big. I think there's some Notifier or Honeywell folks on that too, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially it's getting HJs and the industry ready for remote style inspections and testing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the pandemic accelerated that because it actually was needed during that time. There were HJs and jurisdictions that you couldn't be in person, right? So they had an option for that remote video feed or whatever to do that verification of that fire alarm system.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of accelerated that, but obviously you guys did that with the training too. So
Yeah, it's and also everybody's comfort with learning online has gone up. I mean, my kids, of course, they have fatigue about it, and I think that's another
right,
whole thing we have to battle is they had during a crucial part in their in their high school or elementary
right,
school journey, they had to be online. So I think there's also a little bit of that pushback from it. But I think we're starting to strike that balance now. Most of our CFA seminars that we do live, we have a hybrid component. We have cameras there and we can have people online also. I think you always get the best bang for the buck being there, but that's not always feasible. And this way people at least can participate.
Yeah.
And one other big thing we kind of had to adapt to, and I don't know how long it's been a requirement now, but a few years or when previously when you're a registered CFA technician, once you'd kind of got your registration, you were essentially a life member if you kept paying your membership fees. And then we had some fire marshals and that's okay, but we actually want to see a continuing education component.
Yep.
So now we do have a requirement of 8 continuing ed credits per year for our technicians. So that kind of presented a challenge as well to say, okay, well, if we're going to require people to do essentially 8 hours of training, how can we deliver that to them again in a way that's manageable or works? Technicians aren't as flexible as people who work in the office, right? They're booked out on jobs and they're out there making the money, right? So we don't want them tied up doing training all the time necessarily. So that's, again, all of these little things kind of filtered into, okay, how do we need to pivot and change and try and do our best for the membership, right?
Yeah. You also start giving credits for the podcast listens, right?
Yeah, maybe.
I have to verify that somehow.
Somehow, yeah. It is great too with the online having, Mark and I, of course, are in, Western Canada, and it's tough sometimes being involved in companies that are Toronto centric, and a lot of what happens in Canada happens in Toronto. And so for us to be able to be online and be part of these meetings, I mean, me being national marketing director from way out in Vancouver,
right,
over 3,000 miles away from where the CFA's office is, really works because of all this remote. I can get out to Toronto once in a while, but not that often. And also just the communication internally that we have, like within Honeywell now, I'm involved in regulatory meetings that I was never involved in before, but because of our remote, we're on Teams meetings all the time, of course. And that is, sometimes it's not great, but it's also very good for business.
Yeah, and I think it's good for code adoption too. I think it will start to speed up. I know the fire protection industry has traditionally been very slow to adapt and adopt codes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of that remote component should help speed that along, right? Where, you're not having to meet, instead of meeting once a year, you can now meet 3 times a year, one and still in person, but the 2 being virtual, and everybody's comfortable with it now.
So. Yeah, and keep up the constant communication at least. Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, I was just going to say, that is a focus in Canada for sure right now. Is again, we always had our provincial codes and standards, and they were not necessarily in lockstep with each other. So it was difficult for especially national companies to kind of juggle, okay, in this province they're using this standard, and in this province they're using that one. So there has been an effort recently to harmonize our codes and standards across the country, and just again make things like code adoptions a little more consistent, and then it makes it easier for us doing training as well. We're not saying, okay, if you're in Alberta, this is for you, and if you're in Ontario, this is for you. And so it really made it challenging before to say, just kidding, don't pay attention if you live here, but if you live here, you better pay attention. It just got kind of tricky, right?
Well, yeah, we're paying attention down here in the States of how the ULC standards are being rolled out, because I would love to bring that down here too, right? Because it's in different cities, different states have different, it's kind of all NFPA format, but you get jurisdictions that want different things, and it makes it's not standardized everywhere, and it keeps it's complicated at a national or even regional scale. So how do you do that?
We're not perfect yet, but we're trying.
Getting there.
We're trying.
One of our big big challenges actually, and Tim could speak to this better, but you know, because just North America, if we talk at that scale, things are obviously, yeah, very different jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And we have some codes in Canada that, you know, you don't have in the US.
Right.
And so when, you know, all the major manufacturers typically are, you know, American companies. And so when they're developing these products, you know, there'll be some new product that comes on the market and we all get excited and we're like, oh, great. And then, oh, it doesn't meet the Canadian, you know, code for zone LEDs. And so you're like, oh crap, we can't use that now. So
Right.
it's kind of, you know, it can be frustrating sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, the harmonization is great. It's good that we're starting to harmonize UL and ULC standards. But right now, it really is in the US, we do this. In Canada, we do this. So it's a harmonized standard, but it's not truly harmonized yet. And when we have things like, you know, oh, an LED has to be red in this country or amber in this country, that's not great for a manufacturer.
No.
You know, that little tiny thing could be very expensive to roll out. So
yeah,
those things need to still be sharpened up. I mean, we have things like, you know, in Canada having two-stage and having our residential audio applications that we have that are so different than the US, which requires sometimes specific products for a country that is 10% of the business roughly of the US, you know. So it's hard.
Yeah, it's difficult. And I know, you know, fire alarm, you know, you have ULC in Canada and NFPA 72 in the States and elsewhere. Funny enough, sprinkler is aligned on NFPA, and I always wondered that. I'm like, why didn't ULC get into sprinkler? But luckily enough, it, you know, it's harmonized there, at least on the sprinkler side.
Yeah.
Makes it easier for supply chain.
yeah, totally. So with the I guess explain ULC and just for listeners that don't know about, you know, the differences in standards from NFPA to what happens with the ULC in Canada and I guess what's been happening the last few years and what the nation's trying to do to standardize.
Sure. Okay, so maybe a primer on how Canadian codes work. So we have a national model building code, the NBCC, the National Building Code of Canada. That is a model building code, which we then roll out to provinces adopt those. And each one of those is, of course, a governmental decision. So that's going to be the governments in each one of those provinces, kind of like your state governments. They would be deciding on those. Then we have certain, like the city of Vancouver here, where I live on the outskirts of, Vancouver have their own charter. So Vancouver is an anomaly in Canada. There aren't very many cities like that where Vancouver have their own building code and fire code. Can be different than the rest of Canada. Can be different than British Columbia, which is very interesting. So one side of the street would be one code, one other side of the street would be a different code when you're at the border of Vancouver. So, and this is something that I've lived with as, you know, fire alarm tech in this town, that, you know, you just drive your truck 5 minutes and you're in a different code site, you're a different code, which is very interesting. But most of Canada runs on province fed from a national building code. Then that building code, of course, is then referring to standards. The building code is only so prescriptive on exactly what to do, kind of like NFPA 72 is for your building codes in the US. So we have, instead of NFPA 72, we have different ULC standards. So those ULC standards, not only are they standards of product like UL has, they are also standards of installation and application sometimes. A lot of the application is in the building code, but then there's also references from ULC, say on smoke detector spacing, on what to do with certain types of ceiling constructions and beam depths and all that kind of stuff when you're dealing with smoke detectors. Those would be in ULC, not in the building code. So it can be a little confusing. You have to refer to one and the other, because also building code will tell you when you need to use smokes, you know, depending on the occupancy. So you have to refer to all those documents together. And then, of course, we come into after that, that's making a project, that's doing a new building. Then we have fire code after that. Once the building is occupied, that would hit the National Fire Code, which is the model. And then the provinces build their own fire codes based on that model code. And those can differ quite widely depending on which province. So all these harmonizations that we're starting to work on in the last couple of years here is a mandate that this first one is within 24 months of the new code, the 2020 building code having come in, and it was delayed to 2022 because of COVID.
Yep.
So finally, when it came in, they had 24 months, which gets us, the clock is ticking. We're now in it. And this is what's happening this spring, is that the provinces need to get on board. So the province of Manitoba and Saskatchewan both announced that they are January 1st. They were moving on. Province of Manitoba announced it months ago, so they had some time, even though there was still ensuing panic from that. But province of Saskatchewan announced it basically in December, that January they were switching over. So it was very fast.
Wow.
And you're going to see, we just found out, I think Alberta is going to be May 1st. BC is looking around the same time. So that's Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Ontario, we're not sure about yet. They always tend to have a lot of changes they want specifically in Ontario.
Yep.
They have a very active, group there. So that still is, we're waiting for the decision on that. Quebec also we're waiting. And then the Atlantic provinces, I haven't heard yet. We tend to get the territories, the northern part of Canada, because it's happening, a lot of decisions are happening from Toronto or Edmonton or Vancouver. They tend to go with the national model codes up there, tends to. So we'll see what happens here. It seems to be that's what's going to be. But I think we're going to have all of that by probably May, June. It'll all have washed out, I hope, and we'll start to know. That's a lot. When you start digging into what the code changes were, and that's a lot for the scope of just our conversation today, but there's so many changes, and that's what Mark and I are really striving for in this podcast, is to do some micro learning chapters on dig into specific parts of it.
Yep.
And Mark, you want to speak a little bit more to that, because you're doing that also in seminars, right?
Yeah, so the some of the major changes that we have or that we're seeing is the ULC standards themselves have always had, and you're well aware of this now, Drew, with InspectPoint, is they've always had a template for what is an annual fire alarm inspection supposed to look like, or an idea of what it can look like, but it was never enforced. It wasn't you shall use this template. It was just kind of a, hey, here's something you can kind of base your own forms off of. Yep. But now with the adoption of the 2019 standard, that is in there to say, you know what, no, we want you to use this specific format, numbering, everything needs to look exactly like this. And that was based on a lot of feedback. I'm sure there was lots of different reasons, but some just being, if you're an AHJ and an authority having jurisdiction who's looking at these reports, it gets really difficult if every report looks different, right? You don't really know, does this show deficiencies? Does it not? It was really confusing for both end users or building owners, but also the fire service to look and go, what are we looking at here? So it'll kind of help with that, but how we deal with deficiencies is going to be a little bit different, and how we document them, making sure there's code references and yep. So we don't have a technician saying, this building was built 30 years ago, and now I feel like it should be up to, today's building code. And you go, well, no, those aren't really deficiencies. It's, it could be a recommendation or something. So in some regards, we've kind of caught up to what NFPA has been doing. With some defined terms, and what is a deficiency, what is a recommendation, and then on the new construction side, again, some of the things that we've seen down south in the U.S. and other places, we still hadn't gotten to. So low frequency sounders, for example, we never used those in Canada. They've always been available to us, but our codes didn't prescribe in a dwelling unit you need that 520 hertz signal. So there's some of it is just catch up. Some of it is, I guess you could call cleanup, really, and trying to ensure that technicians are just doing a little bit better documenting what they're seeing out there. So it's all positive, but to Tim's point, there's a lot of little, nuggets in there that we have to train people on and just make them aware that it now exists.
Yeah, for what I know, right? It moved a lot of like the report template for for ULC 536 and 537 on the verification side, moved from the appendix into the code, right? So it was a suggestion before, now it's required. Yeah, there's some bumps in the road that you'll have to, or the industry, we're all in the industry, right? We'll have to get through there, but obviously the readability for the AHJs and standardization for the technicians and training, that'll make everything better. But data flow, where I see like, hey, if you can capture all this data, you're going to know, hey, these are the top 10 deficiencies that we've seen across this province or across the whole nation of Canada, right? So where should we be focusing our efforts on the next code from there, right? Can we dive into that more where I've seen it? And NFPA's tried it. I did a podcast, I don't know, 3 years ago on the project that NFPA tried to do for standardization of data collection from inspection and maintenance. And there wasn't they tried to do it, but there wasn't, all the data is all over the place. And so until you have those kind of report standards and code standards in place that are required to look this way, you're not going to get the data looking that way. Yeah. So again, it's another benefit of that. So
yeah, the standardization, having technicians across Canada that actually, could move from Alberta to BC and do work, all those kind. As we're getting, we're having work shortages in US and Canada both, and very hard to find qualified people. And being able to use our workforces, especially for, say, national companies like Troy, a lot of my distributors, same thing. I have quite a few national companies, and being able to use your technician resources, depending on especially large projects. Maybe you need a couple of senior techs on that big mine project. And now there's also all these different, authorities and training that's needed. This is going to make that kind of flow a lot easier throughout Canada. And when we have a diamond mine that comes up or a gold mine that comes up, those are big, projects, billions of dollars projects you need to send people to. This ends up helping that a lot.
And hopefully at it, and I don't know if you guys are looking at it is the ULC standard looking at some of the remote inspection and testing and all that? I know NFPA is working on it. Is ULC potentially bringing that in? Because I know, obviously, Tim, you work for Notifier. You have some pretty cool products on automated testing and stuff.
Yeah, the CLSS suite. Yeah. So in the connected life safety suite, which Edwards have very similar. All of our competitors have a very similar. I'm wearing the CFAA hat today, so I don't want to be too self-promoting. Always have to dance that line, All right. But I think we are all on the same page. I do a presentation across Canada on the future of fire alarm, and it's very agnostic, and we talk about all the different technologies out there. And in my research of doing that talk, I found out, yes, all of us are on the same page on this. We're all looking for how we can do this. We're all up against the same cybersecurity walls too, or just in general, we have a lot of governmental agencies or even school districts who don't want things on cloud. So even just simple things like that, where those are some of the headwinds we're up against, all of us are.
Right.
And how do we deal with that? How do we make that safe for these end users and these consumers of these products? You and I make the same decisions at home on what we decide we want on the cloud or not. And that's what these end users are doing. I think we need to respect that as, you are, and myself, selling these products is watching how would we make that decision as a consumer? And then in the products that we're trying to sell, what can we adjust, for these guys? But all these headwinds of that's all going to come into the development of these codes and standards. I don't know that, ULC at this point, it is, especially when we talk about remote testing, you got to be on site. You got to have somebody on site. Yes, you could have a senior tech maybe helping remotely. And that could meet ULC, depending again, how you do it as a company. You're not just going to have an electrician there, some, junior electrician there who's manning the panel while you're, 1,000 miles away.
Sure.
That's probably not a good idea,
Right.
So it's finding the ways to do that.
And again, like in a country like like Canada, again, we have such a huge geography, right? So these services are actually really, really beneficial to our end users. And so that's, to Tim's point, something, on the sales side of things, how do we get that message out to, all these building owners, operators, the big property management companies, all of that, to say, like, these tools are available. Yes, we can't program a panel remotely, or we can't test a panel remotely, at least right now. But just the diagnostic ability. When I was a technician, working in Edmonton, I'd have to hop in my service vehicle and drive, 5-6 hours sometimes just to get to a service call. And you get there and it's, oh, it's just a battery. And you're like, man, now this customer has to pay this huge bill because I had all this travel time, and really it was a, $60 fix.
Yep.
Where, now we have the technology, we can look at that panel and go, oh, it's a battery trouble. And, maybe there is someone local who we can say, hey, go pick up a 7 amp hour battery and go put it in and clear the trouble. Right. And so those are kind of some of the, at least for now, the use cases that we have for the connected, gateways, and
they meet the standards and codes doing that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But a lot of people aren't aware of it, right? It's like anything in fire alarm. So the more we talk about it, the more we make, engineers and especially building owners aware that it exists. I think that's really, really beneficial. So.
Yeah, and AHJs too. I think 915, and if the standard that was created, it's a tool for the AHJ at the end of the day to allow that if it makes sense. Now they have to, it's just a template, but they have to allow it in certain circumstances, but it's giving something, right? And traditionally the industries lag behind other trades. Because of
and to answer your question a little bit too, there is a ULC standard, or it's actually, I believe, a joint standard, ULC UL, on the cybersecurity piece that they've been working on.
Yep.
Because that is one, that's a big factor for a lot of end users is, do I want to allow this equipment onto my network? Just for security reasons. So that is, something that, again, the fire alarm industry is aware of and has worked on to make sure that, these systems are safe. There's no ability for someone to hack into your network or something through your fire alarm now, because that's a real concern.
Those standards that they're working on, I mean, I know they're working in templating off of what the US is doing and NFPA is doing for these standards. And I know I've been in the room for some of this, and the challenge is how to keep the standard evergreen as our technologies change fast. The standard has to just be so general, and people are like, well, it should specifically talk about this. Well, if it does, that could go away in 5 years. Then what? And it's
or 5 months.
Or 5 months, right? Software is so fast.
Oh,
which, for fire alarms, this is relatively new for us in fire alarm to be so software driven. As we get to our phones or our iPads or whatever pane of glass that we're using for fire alarm, and it's just this software head end, and it's possibly not as proprietary, that becomes tough from a standards point of view.
Right. Yeah. No, it's fun stuff to talk about, and I've been wanting to do this, something with obviously CFAA, because they're a great organization within just the fire alarm community throughout the world. I think what you guys do to empower the technicians is one up on a lot of associations out there. So
that's good. We are trying, and definitely hear from our members that we could be doing more, and we are trying to do more. That this podcast, doing the e-journal, trying to bring in driven content that is technically savvy, that is important, at the same time possibly accessible also for end users and AHJs to be able to read it and not be lost. And I think that's something in the podcast too, is trying to balance between getting into the weeds for some stuff, but always pulling back and trying to make it accessible for everyone. And that's a tough balance to make it valuable for everybody that's listening.
Yeah. It's and hey, yeah. You try to balance it out, and again, we've tried to do over the last 4.5 years. Again, you know, Chris Logan's a great buddy of mine in the Ontario area. He started the Fire Sprinkler podcast, and we bounce ideas out. Hey, what should we talk about? Or, you know, don't double up on guests or whatever. There's not that many of us in this fire podcast community, so it's kind of it was very exciting to learn about what you guys are doing with the CFAA.
Yeah, and I think our content, we're really going to drive it to Canadian codes, to technicians who are on the site, trying to make it, you know, my idea, the vision was, when I was talking to Mark about this, you know, initially was, I'm thinking about a tech leaving the office and going to a site, and in their truck, in his or her truck, they can listen to this podcast, and they'll have that time, and it's micro learning. It's like they were in the truck with a senior tech for 15 minutes.
Yep.
And that's kind of what we want. I think it's very focused in that way, that there isn't something else exactly like that out there. And I think that's a good thing. You know, Chris is doing a good job. You're doing a great job. I've been listening to both your podcasts, and great content. And it's good, I think, for, you know, guys like Mark and I, that we can hear perspectives on what NFPA is doing, because then we can have that context when decisions are being made for ULC. We know that a lot of the people are in these NFPA meetings also, and, you know, we don't always get the exposure ourselves to the US codes and standards. So it's good for us.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what we talk about too is, as much as it's geared towards, you know, Canadian codes and standards, you know, the topics themselves are the, you know, the best practices, if you want to call that, is applicable to any technician, whether you're fire alarm, even sprinkler, you know, extinguishers, all of those field service technicians who are interacting with customers, right? It's not easy sometimes, and so it's nice to get those little tips every now and then and make your day a little better, hopefully.
Yeah. And a lot of the technician fitters, whatever, depends on who I'm talking to. Do I say fitter first, or do I say technician first? You know, it's starting to blend together, right? And a lot of the companies do a multitude of subsectors inside of fire. So you need to know more in the field these days than just your traditional, you know, fire alarm or just sprinkler, you know.
Yeah. And just trying to change that culture a little bit too, of your company is not solely responsible for training you. You know, having that mindset of, you know, seeking out information and wanting to learn and better yourself is more important than ever, but it's also, there's more opportunity to do that than ever. So, you know, we're just another one of those ways, I guess.
And another part to the scope of our podcast, if I can tease on some of our content coming up here, is it isn't, I've talked about it, you know, topics being on codes and standards. We are spreading it out a little bit further than that too. We have an ongoing series that I've already recorded and I'm editing on a panel that I did with women in fire alarm. And we're working on their specific experience in fire alarm, you know, what that looks like and how that's developing in the last few years. Also, you know, I started one podcast. We started talking about ground faults and troubleshooting, and it started actually getting to the psychology of being on site and troubleshooting, and how panels and wires can be quite easy, and they have manuals a lot of times, but people don't, and people can be the tougher context there or the tougher variable to work with. So you know, things like that too are really good to talk about. And again, that's things that I've had great conversations with senior techs or people in CFAA rooms. But a lot of our techs that are out there on site, they don't get to be in these rooms and have these conversations. So hopefully you can do that within this podcast.
No, that's awesome. Hey, I'd love to come on your podcast once you guys get you know, get some open time at some point too.
We'll get you on. Yeah. We'll at least record it. We'll put it on. We'll slate it in there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
This has been episode 57 of the Fire Protection Podcast, powered by Inspect Point. Want to thank Tim and Mark from the CFAA Fire Alarm Technician Podcast. Obviously, they have their separate gigs, but it was really cool to see that the CFAA and those guys specifically are going ahead and starting a podcast like this to get more information out to the technicians and the fire alarm community, not only within Canada, but throughout the world. I think it's going to kind of spread from there as well. So again, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.